Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session for today in English about the European sovereign cloud market. My name is Max Görbecher. I'm from the sovereign cloud community. We're trying to build an independent sovereign community around cloud, data, and AI. And yeah, this is our second live stream, or actually, it's our fourth, if you count also the German one, but our second topic that we are put today into our live stream. And I said we're going to talk today about the European cloud market. What's in the box for today? So we will have a look about the European clouds and what is shaping the market. We will have a look about the hyperscalers and why they are not losing their grip actually here. Going into the understanding of the edge cloud continuum, because that's often something which might be misunderstandable in some way, or there's not enough understanding at all for the topic. You'll look into an idea for the multi-cloud strategy version 2. And last but not least, we'll wrap it up with the question, is sovereign cloud maybe a little bit too much hyped? If you have any questions, feel free to write it into the chat. You can comment under the YouTube video, you can comment in Sulip and write me there, or directly personal message sent over. Happy to pick up the questions. And with that, let's start into this topic for today. So interestingly enough, we have actually to think about that there is no such kind of sovereign cloud itself. It's a terminology which we use a lot, and I think it's sometimes a little bit too much overused. But when we actually have to first slice and dice the market, we need to think about traditional cloud providers, which have a little bit longer history. We have neo cloud providers, which are the, let's say, I don't want to say little ones, but who are the new players on the market. And that's very often a question of the sovereign cloud providers. And then we have GPU clouds. GPU clouds, especially through the whole hype about AI, is a relevant part here and is continuously ramping up a game. We also see that in Europe, at least, it's like also very fast in a consolidation phase, cutting down the first one or two GPU provider. So not a topic for today. And within this, let's say, columns or the silos of different cloud providers, we have also obviously some kind of tiers. We have the top tier, which is the always go-to cloud provider, the first ones which comes to your head. And they are, well, in some point are outstanding because they are very good in being, let's say, a good counterpart for enterprise-grade scale. They have a huge feature set. They, practically make cloud a topic for companies, and with that history, with that past, with that standing, they're obviously also a very trusted advisor in this part. And from here, we have a few levels below that who maybe lack some features, maybe lack some identity access management capabilities that needed for our enterprise providers, and so on and so forth. And now think about this like a matrix, right? You have your different silos for clouds, neo clouds, GPU clouds, and then you have your different tiers. And sovereign cloud providers are not necessarily something that needs to fit into this grid, but for most of them, we are somewhere between a cloud and a neo cloud provider. That's not on a top tier, but also not on the bottom tier. Also, we have there some providers that are maybe not really considered as a cloud provider itself, but that play still a big role, at least in Europe. And when we think this way, we come very fast to the conclusion it's complicated. And it's indeed very, very complicated to understand the German and the European cloud market and to get a big picture overall. So what does the numbers say? Well, very clearly, the US providers are combined owning 70% of the cloud market. AWS, around about 30%. That's huge. Azure was 21 and GCP was 13%. And then IBM and Oracle are adding combined 6% in addition. This is a huge market share. And I always would like to say, like, we need to be a little bit careful about the market share because it is a picture in time, right? It's a snapshot. We don't necessarily know in which direction it grows, except we compare the market share over the last years. But that's also a science for itself because there's no really great numbers around the cloud market, just like big thumb calculations. Where Europe is standing is that the cloud providers here are holding around 15%. We can see here a little bit like the trending line. 2% is like a magic mark that, for example, SAP and the Deutsche Telekom are a little bit over 2% of a market share, where then OVH, Telecom Italia, Orange are slightly below this 2%. So this is a little bit a magic border. Many of those providers are expected to also jump over this 2%. But it depends on how they are going to act on the market to actually achieve that. And we will look into this in a few minutes. And then there is a market segment, which I didn't really want to include into the European providers itself, because it's like a regional market providers that you know from here and there, where we have thousands of little system houses that are providing you compute capacities, and they have something between 5 to 10% also of the market share. So they are not that irrelevant if you think about that. Actually, they own quite a good piece of the cake. The interesting stuff is that some of those are not that small as we believe it. That's also like somehow that we have a misconception here around that everything needs to be a cloud provider just to be huge and large and being global scale. But that's not the truth. A lot of the system houses, for example, have multiple data centers, for example, within Germany, but also across Europe, but even overseas. And that's actually crazy if you think about like, oh, it's just a little provider, regional one, nothing serious. No, some of them have a big market share itself. If you combine this up, you're missing maybe some percentages. And yes, there is something missing, which is the Asian part, the Asian providers. Also here, we have to be very, very careful about any kind of numbers. There's nothing really precise and good to be found. Most of those numbers are disclosed. It's estimated that they own 5 to 10% of the market. And this actually plays well together with the estimated 5 to 10% of the regional providers. Somewhere in between will be the balance. Now, as I said, like this number itself is like just helping for as a snapshot. But for us, it's important, how does the market actually develop? And which direction does it move? And here we have to take a look into the market growth. The European cloud provider market is estimated to be like growing around 24% from 2024 to 2025. And it currently looks like it most likely will hit this direction. There's nothing that tells something different. Now, if we take a look, the US providers like Amazon, that's only 19%. So it's a little bit below the actual market growth, which means on the other hand side, it might lose in the next year a few percent, maybe 1%, maybe 2% of the market share. While Azure and GCP with 31 and 28% are growing above the market growth. And for that, they are actually, in the end, a very strong driver for the actual size of the market growth. Due to the disbalance of the share on the market, those three providers itself are practically the driving force why the actual European cloud market is growing that fast. Because if you take a look to the European cloud providers, it tells a different story. I just picked a few where we can maybe tell something about the numbers, where we have OVH with around 10%, or Ionos around 9%. Also, I expect, for example, Ionos to spike up in the next year due to their public deals which they have closed in this year. I also would like to pick up here Scaleway. It's not 100% clear which numbers are behind that because they are part of the Iliad Group, a telecommunication provider, but they most likely grow around about 37%, which would be a very, very huge growth, and which, in my opinion, means that Scaleway has the possibility to come close to this 2% magic number, and maybe we'll go over it. Also, they are more on the neo cloud side, I would say. Asian providers and regional providers are extremely difficult to put in any kind of context. Again, numbers are missing here. The only thing which we can take a look is like, how is the presence on the market? How are their marketing spent? Do they go often into events? Do they grow their team? Do they increase their partner network? But all of this can be also just funded, especially for the Asian providers. And there is no relevant change in the last years to be seen, which is kind of interesting. So the estimation is they go with the flow, they stay with the size of the market and do their thing. For the regional providers, we can't tell. If we take a look into how healthy those providers are, if we take a look about the activities, if they have some layoffs, if they had to close something, or if they open new data centers, most of them do well. They're good, they're stable in growth, they are stable in their enrichment of features. So it is to be estimated that they maybe also will have around their 10-20%, again, big guess here, of yearly growth. But it can be also more. If we take a look on UpCloud from Finland, they did exceptionally 87% year-over-year growth. And this is insane for a kind of small provider, I would say. Now, if you do your own research on those numbers, they might vary. I have found like dozens of different sources, depending on which country you're looking at. Some provider in different countries looks a little bit more successful than others. But overall, those numbers should show the right direction. One thing, though, which is very interesting, is that if we take a look on the total share of the European cloud providers, as I've shown before, with a 15%, the European market share was before COVID around 27, maybe up to 30%. But COVID has drove so much digitalization that the European market most likely could not catch up enough or was not scalable enough, which give the US provider a massive push and increase their market share drastically within 2-3 years. And since then, we are still with some kind of this market share. We are locked into it. And I think that's actually a missed opportunity in the past, that we haven't take care enough to really use this digitalization boom. But it's also slightly a problem if suddenly everyone, quote unquote, comes in and would like to scale, that you cannot scale them. So we have options over options in Europe. And I have picked some of the, I would say, cloud providers you very fast find somewhere, come up with. It's important to say there's at least like 10 more of partially similar relevance or sizes, especially for the neo cloud providers. But they're also coming up GPU providers like Nscale in UK, who now have signed a contract with OpenAI to build something in Norway. So there's movement in the market, which is relevant for it. And we have just too many options to look at. So a pure evaluation of all of them is practically, I would not say impossible, but it doesn't give the insight which we expect to see. I see one question about if there's an overview. So well, as I said, it most likely doesn't make so much sense to really create a full overview of all providers, of all options, especially if it depends on like what we are actually talking about. What are you looking for? Is it a cloud provider with a higher automation, high autonomy, high management service, and so on? Or is it just infrastructure that you get cheap and can manage? Totally different thing. Some people would say just a managed infrastructure is not a cloud. So there's no good one picture for everything. And it would be hundreds of companies, or even thousands maybe, which we have to put here. We have in Europe multiple thousands of data centers, with I think UK, Germany, and France have each something around 390, 400 data center by themselves. Plus, then everyone else around has also some combined amount of data centers. So there's huge movement. A question which we always discuss in this regards is like, what does the US provider do different? What we have to learn from them? And I think the COVID case showed it very clearly is like that the scale matters. If you're too big to fail and you can just grow as you need, even if something spikes up, you have enough capacities to do so, then you have a very big market advantage. The thing is also that we always forget about that they have a huge funding in their back, because as a US provider, you have a generally large market with entire North America, partially Middle America. You are already well funded so that you can just buy in your stake in Europe. And it makes sense because in the end, the big US providers are leading the market. They have practically invented the cloud market, right? So why it's not what we can learn from it. They have innovated early and bring a new concept to us, and that's how they and where they are standing now. The other side is that obviously the large enterprises often are not selling their bread and butter in front of their door, right? They're selling it around Europe, around the globe. And it makes sense in the first to think about that you have a global partner, a global infrastructure provider, which goes along with all of your international activities. We can discuss about the amount of services. I'm often not a fan about discussing itself. I think the most companies maybe would need 20 to 30 of the services. Everything else is nice to have in the best case. However, the amount of services helps to also pick up edge cases, to pick up companies who are looking for a very specific problem to be solved. And with solving that, you obviously just not get one potential customer, you sometimes get an entire industry to use your solution. Due to his history and time, also the American providers have an unmatched ecosystem. It's growing big, strong. Many of SaaS solutions have a very native integration into cloud providers, so they do not need to fiddle it around to find a solution how to do the integration, or you can buy a lot of those solutions through the marketplace, directly spin it up into your system, and you have absolutely zero effort to get something up and running. And last but not least, that's something which we very often forget. They're just designed for enterprises. They're designed for extremely large, complex companies. We see that already in the identity and access management, in the way how services are provided, standard contracts, high insurances, fast response times. And they also have developed a set of interesting hybrid possibilities to also come to Europe and solve the European problems, which we have with, for example, being extremely fragmented. Those seems to be obvious topics, but those are the reasons why American providers have a very high, and for sure, in some way, they've earned the stake to stay where they are. But is it something which we couldn't solve in some way for ourselves? I think what often comes to short, especially about the European cloud providers, is that we don't do so much wrong. We're just small, or the providers are just small. If we take a look about, for example, how they are built, most of the European cloud providers are built with open source. This gives you actually sovereignty in a pure manner in some way, because you can go from one provider to another provider, at least with the applications or whatever you do on top of it, to really being independent from the underlying infrastructure. Most likely, you need something that is You need to change something that orchestrates those things. However, the foundation for it is there, and this provides you high flexibility. The other very big advantage is costs. There's practically almost none European provider that is not at least 30% cheaper than a US provider. And some services are even 50% cheaper, sometimes even for like CPUs and stuff like that. We see here often discussions like, oh yeah, but I get saving plans, I get discounts. If I make a spend commit, I get more discounts. And it's like, that's true. But to be honest, why do you need so much discount from a European provider if he's anyhow cheaper? Maybe it's just a little bit more honest business model. Maybe. However, in some services, European providers are also a little bit more expensive, for example, in the token utilization, right? So not everything is directly cheaper. What we also can say is that, at least for the neo clouds, most of them are state of the art and they use latest technology, they are focused on latest technology, and sometimes even challenge the status quo. I always like to give you the example of Scaleway, who have decided to use and introduce Nuts as a message streaming server instead of Kafka. And for me as an architect, I would say that makes sense. Kafka is not the solution for everything. It's just too large, just too complicated. Yes, it is used on many, many places, but this doesn't mean that it's used right. And if you need an entirely large Apache Kafka system, you either would anyhow go to Confluent Cloud as a provider, but even there, usually this complexity of the systems which you have built, at least from my experience, requires a lot of additional features in, a huge kind of a complex setup that even then you are better suited to build the Kafka by yourself or run it and operate it by yourself. Only then you can cover the extreme large use cases. So challenge sometimes the status quo is not that bad. Last but not least, I think many of the smaller cloud providers do a very good job in being manageable. The complexity is way less, and it's easier to come around to find the right approach, how to do what. Sometimes people say like, oh, they lack a lot of features, but I have made the experience that many special functionalities or many special configurations are hidden behind the infrastructure as code or CLI, because it's anyhow not best practice to click around in the UI to do something. You better code it and deploy it. I would like to shortly dive a little bit deeper into this cost comparison, because this is something which we see very, very often directly being pulled out. And I also would kindly ask you to handle that with care. We'll come to that in a while, but some of those ratings are not directly very correct. Others of these ratings are a little bit too opinionated. So you can fall into a trap that what I have seen already, to push more on sovereignty and that it's way more cheaper, is that they have chosen a region in Europe which is expensive for a US provider and have chosen the cheapest location for a European provider. So the gap is even bigger. But that doesn't make sense. This comparison, at least, is like all from Frankfurt region. So it's more or less comparison, at least from the environmental costs, and therefore shouldn't be too much difference in the costs normally. I have marked with these little boxes every time the highest number or the best number, so lowest prices or the highest rating, and I've additionally marked everything that is maximum 0.5 points worth, so which is very, very close to it. And you can see for computing, GPUs, RAM, you have a lot of the new cloud providers or sovereign cloud providers that have a cost benefit. And if we take a closer look to, for example, the CPU costs, we see that something like Nayonos Scaleway is the half or less than the half of what AWS, for example, costs. So there's a huge difference in some of those things. If you take a look more into the newer kind of services, be it Kubernetes, be it serverless, be it AI tokens, there we can see that actually the American cloud providers are for some stuff very competitive. Other stuffs are not very correct. For example, most of the other cloud providers also have like serverless functions, but they are built in a different way. And so it's not a really good comparison here, but you could add that into this comparison if you want. What so is interesting is that egress almost never costs something in European cloud providers or costs nothing until a certain level of gigabytes. So very cost-efficient way here to maybe think more about a multi-cloud or hybrid cloud infrastructure because you do not have costs for outgoing traffic. Yes, there's one comment that in the table there is one thing worse rated, even though the price is lower. I've seen that too. I think it's here about the RAM, I guess. No, here it's about the GPU costs, for example, for Scaleway. It's rated with a 9 out of 10 in comparison to OVH Cloud with 9.6 out of 10, even though it is 60 cents cheaper. So not all of the ratings itself are correct. Maybe I should have put here boxes too. But as I said, always with such comparison, handle it with care. I think I've never seen any comparison that is completely neutral and tries to stay completely neutral. Let's have a look into something that's confusing a lot of people when we are talking about, and where a lot of people do not know what it actually means. And this is the Edge Cloud Continuum. That is a terminology which you will find whenever you look into the broader European discussion about cloud, about funding budget for cloud, about programs that support European cloud. You always will find the three magical words Edge Cloud Continuum. And that has a little bit of a history where there was a policy made in Brussels called the European Data Strategy. And this was actually a smart idea to say, like, look, we acknowledge that we have a fragmented market, that we are a lot of countries, but let's find a way how we can at least have a good way of exchanging data with each other so that this is not a problem to collaborate. And very fast after that one, the thought was hardened into the joint declaration on building the next generation cloud in Europe. So it's practically the follow-up paper to the European Data Strategy, which is like pointing more to an actual direction how to solve that. And to come up with a strategy, there was then the 2030 Digital Compass that in the end shaped all of the realization paths through different organizations, through different funding budgets. So very soon the European Alliance for Industrial Data, Edge and Cloud was founded. And followed after that, the Gaia X project, which most know maybe, was created. I don't want to discuss if it's really worse to look deeper into Gaia X. I was personally for a few months as part of the architecture board, and I decided to leave it. I could not find value in it, I have to admit. But I think what it does very well is that it drove the discussion about what we actually need. And I think it showed very clearly that we need doing. We don't need paper, right? It doesn't make sense to discuss over and over again which data schemas, which reference architecture, things like that we need to build. Most of the outcomes were something which it's very bad to say, but an IT student from the second or third semester could draw if that person would think 5 minutes about. And so out of that drive, we come to the point that the EU Cloud Edge IoT initiative was found. And you can see here already this combination of Edge and IoT. So the Edge Cloud Continuum is, you need to think about, it's very old. It still comes from the time where we believed that IoT is the next industrial revolution. I mean, it's a thing, but it's not as revolutionary, at least not at the moment, like AI, for example. But this initiative got a couple of million euros, 100 million euros, to invest strategically into solutions to solve that market problems. And the last funding budget created out of that one was then the IPKITE-SYS. And this is the only initiative which I really, really appreciate out of all of these initiatives, because it's call for action. Yes, there's a lot of paperwork around it to take part in IPSAI, but frankly speaking, there's finally some relevant budget that you can use to create sovereign solutions, to create sovereign cloud solutions. And as far as I can see it from the initiatives which are developed, all of them are open source, all of them are pushing forward, pushing technology stacks forward that are fitting to the European cloud market very well. So in short, this Edge Cloud Continuum really wants to recognize and acknowledge and empower the complexity of the European market, right? The fragmentation, the strong physical industry which we have, the high level of distribution of the companies across the countries. But also there, it's kind of special. For example, in France, you have a very huge hub in Paris, right? If you compare Germany, practically every larger city has a healthy ecosystem of larger enterprises. So Germany is a little bit more complex to build up also a new relevant industry here. And then what the Edge Cloud Continuum primarily focus on is Europe as an IoT pioneer. Again, I think they bet a little bit on the wrong horse, but it fits to our industry. It fits to our history as Europe, as an entire continent. So why do we not just think cloud differently? That's often a very, very interesting question. I try to challenge the existing models because I, frankly speaking, not very often happy with the existing cloud models. They feel like we do IT, they feel like we do computing like we did the last 60 years, quote unquote. And we see that it's become more and more complex. So if you take a look in the enterprises, the average enterprise have something between 2 and 3 top US provider and 2 and 3 local infrastructure provider, depending on the business model, right? Some have 2, 3 local infrastructure provider per country, per continent, and so on. What we see is a trend that it's becoming more. It's not becoming less. There's no consolidation in enterprises happening. It's becoming more complex providers that are added up. So a large enterprise can easily have 6, 10, 15 different providers. They for sure sometimes doesn't play that large role than the top tier provider, but still you have a dedicated team that takes care about it. The cloud repatriation, I would say, is not a real thing anymore. I personally believe it's a very big chance for the sovereign cloud community to pick up on companies who want to repatriate and want to leave US providers. But I think this was a very short hype, especially after Schrems 2, that companies have to go this way to think about it with an exit strategy. And actually waiting for Schrems 3 results would maybe cause the next wave of the repatriation. But yeah, I think companies understood it maybe doesn't make that much sense to build own data center or at least to have bigger data centers own your infrastructure to run it. And then we have obviously the part of that we depending on industries. We have edge locations. I said some have just like a server under the desk, others have a server room in their local office building, and others are really like have a distributed edge locations with hundreds of edge locations to provide a very fast and good service. So I try to visualize it very simple here. Do we need to think about the cloud differently if we think about how it is distributed? And this is a common picture that global enterprises often can draw, but also like regional companies that are maybe have just one or two presence abroad, maybe can build on. So what we see is that we have often bridges between continents, and then that we have the similar provider that is used in Europe is, for example, used in China. I believe with the hope that it is the same, but actually, from my experience, the platforms which we have built in China, it looks same. It is not same. It doesn't behave the same way. It's more complicated, and you have a lot of struggle actually to get things in, and you have a lot of struggle to get things out. Actually, don't get things out. Then you have all these different locations, right? This can be your edge locations, this can be your own data center, whatsoever. So for an enterprise, I would say this is a pretty conservative picture how their global distribution can look like. And what we also need to understand is that usually you have also silos within the company. So just because you use the same cloud provider in US and Europe doesn't mean it's the same. The teams are different, the experience is different, maybe even the practices to implement are different. Yes, we could try to standardize this, and that's what a lot of company does, but the reality is often that it's very separated. So what we often hear and look at is a zonal concept, a zonal cloud strategy. And it has multiple different, I would say, advantages, and it also has some disadvantages. We often hear like, if you think about a zonal concept, then you have more cloud providers. But I think you don't need to do that if you're not going for multiple providers per zone, right? If you choose for one provider in US, if you have one big provider for Europe, one for China, one for the Southern Hemisphere, and so on, in total, you have less providers because the zonal concept practically supports also that you have local infrastructure providers, and you might not need their capacities anymore if you have providers that on your market. So what I pretty much like about the zonal concept is that it's also gives you advantages, especially like dealing with local laws, and it can leverage the competency in the regional market. But especially what I think is a very big help for the market is that you also, through your investment, help the regional cloud market to strengthen their infrastructure, to provide new services and become better, so that they become also more attractive for other users to be used, and so on. So it's really like a loop which can get kickstarted. And such strategic investments, right, rather than to invest hundreds of millions in a commit spend for one large cloud provider, you can slice that down, because for a smaller cloud provider, maybe half of 100 of a million means already the world. And if you go this approach, you would massively help the company and the country, and this maybe even can guarantee you some easier governmental support or governmental access to either further resources or just to help to do better collaboration. So there can be a lot of business impacts if done right. And the multi-zonal concept is not that much more complicated than actually how we do it nowadays. Because we also see that usually in a large cloud provider, they are meanwhile so misconfigured that you have thousands of accounts. You do not know who is owning what. Sometimes it's very difficult to differentiate if it's now just in this region or in that region. But if it's in that region, you need to follow other rules and so on and so forth. So the complexity around it is getting more. And I think it's meanwhile so complex that it literally makes a difference if you just build for one provider or if you build multiple providers, because you anyhow have multiple providers in-house. So I see one question about, isn't there a lot of functions missing for you EU providers? Well, I think that's a question of the business case you would like to implement. As said, I personally believe that most cloud providers, especially in Europe, have everything what you need. there's very often not a case where you need something more special, right? I have more the feeling that if departments or different use cases need something super special, it's often artificially approached this point. Like, for example, Kafka. Many companies using Kafka. I've built and implemented Kafka myself a few years back and was the first containerization in that regards. And we never reached the scale, even though we handled petabyte of data and so on. It was not the size which we built on. So, is sovereignty a hype? Absolutely. It would be unrealistic not to acknowledge that. But I think we have a wrong perspective, and the tone which you find in the market is the wrong tone, because it's like, oh, it almost feels like the stupid Europeans now imagine to cut off all ropes and to be independent. This doesn't mean sovereignty, but talked about this already in the first live stream. You can rewatch it. The point is, we are not alone, right? Brazil, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Indonesia, the Emirates, Turkey, Vietnam, South Africa. They are all working in the same direction, sometimes with different approaches, putting policies which are way more stricter than our policies, right? In South Korea, if we believe that the data protection in Germany is high, it's kindergarten against South Korean data protection. And still, yet, they are way more advanced and high tech with what they can do, because they have taken some different advantages and approaches here. Or, for example, Vietnam is pushing a lot on investing in local markets and keep the local market growing and not just spend money outside of the country. So yes, it is hyped, but I think it is only to our best, because it allows us to discuss open and honestly also a lot about like how we're doing things and question the approaches and architectures which we have chosen. I think it puts also pressure on well-placed cloud providers to rethink some things, how they are doing it, to reposition themselves, and maybe to look left and right what are like the neo cloud providers are doing, and how to become those little bit more, sexiness in some way. I think for the European provider, there's a few things missing to be more successful. The neo cloud providers are doing exceptionally well and looking good and being clear, but sometimes they really are not on the point of developer friendliness or have a up-to-date documentation. It often comes weeks later. And the biggest pain point, which I don't understand why there's practically none cloud provider in Europe, is that you're not have built your user and access management for enterprises. This is such a pain that I'm there with you. It's also not right how enterprises are doing it, but you want to win the customer. So maybe find a way to do that. We have seen so many different end users dropping off or not keeping this exploring, in European cloud provider, more because they understand that the user and access management doesn't suit their needs and demand. And with that, it doesn't matter which other services are there, it's killed. And then there are other European cloud providers where you really need to invest into a clear way of doing it. Sometimes it feels like you're shopping servers and then you have to wait for it hours until you get it. Sometimes it's not clear that a provider is really a provider. I ended up on a few, especially regional providers, that didn't point out at all that they can host you. It's like, yeah, contact us, but for what? But I think it's not only looking into the provider, but also looking into the end users and being here very clear and pushy on saying like, hey, you have to also commit to European providers. Why you need to make such large spend commits to settle down cloud providers when you anyhow will not spend that much money, right? Then you can also spend that money on something small and settle down a regional implementation. And last but not least, and this is maybe the painful process, but we think have to undergo it, is the natural consolidation process. We have a lot of new cloud providers. The sovereign cloud topic is pushing. We see a lot of moving pieces in the market. And we see it also with the GPU clouds, right? Fast coming up, fast getting consolidated. I think that's also what we will have in the next steps and what we will see in the next 1 to 2 years on the market. Because through consolidation, we maybe can achieve a larger scale. And I think there's a magic area above 5% going to 10%, which is an extreme large scale for a European company in the cloud market. But if one can achieve this direction, that would be a huge, huge win for this topic. With that, some final call to action. Thank you today for joining me. I hope you will have a nice Friday and a beautiful weekend. Do us a favor, follow us on LinkedIn, follow our Luma calendar to not miss the next events. We have planned an event in 2 weeks and then 2 more in November. And we're trying to approach the December and January actually with having panel discussions with the expert round. If you would like to discuss with us directly or any other ideas, join us on Zulip or write us an email. We're very curious to hear about your topics, your experience, and so on and so forth. We are open here for everyone. So if you would like to present something, even in your mother tongue, feel free to come by. We are more than happy to host you, to have you, to discuss with you, and spread your knowledge and experience about sovereign cloud. With that, again, thank you very much. I wish you a great day and see you around.